so CBDCs have become a big topic. I mean, already the name is quite revealing. Central bank digital currencies. I mean, CBDCs are presented as if it's something brand new, when the reality is we've been using BDCs, bank digital currencies, for many decades. There's nothing new about that, and it works well. Bank digital currencies, that's our current system. So the only difference is the central aspect. And who's pushing for this? Well, the central planners. And is there a need for it? No, there's absolutely no need for this. Because the current financial system doesn't have any problems in terms of settlement and transactions, because we have choice. There is a lot of choice. Once you introduce CBDCs, I mean, there's many risks and dangers of that, but one obvious one is that you are actually going to reduce choices, because for CBDCs to properly do their job from the perspective of the issuer, the central banks, you need to get rid of the competition. You need to get rid of cash. That actually is a declared goal of CBDCs. You've got plenty of studies by central banks and other economists in favor of CBDCs arguing that we need to abolish cash and then introduce CBDCs, because then we can have negative interest rates. We can take money directly out of people's pockets. While you still have cash, of course, you can flee from the financial system and put your money to cash, and then they can't punish you with negative interest rates. That's why they want to abolish cash. But also, once you introduce CBDCs, you will actually destroy the banking system, because the next crisis, which the central planners have been very good at creating, when that happens, all the money will be pushed and incentivized to move from banks to the central banks. Then the banks are gone, and you're left with a Soviet-style system. But most of all, the really big dangers of CBDCs are the programmability, which is that essentially it's not even money. It's like your money becomes potential money, because it depends on a central planner to agree that you should now be allowed to spend this money in this location for this particular transaction and in this particular volume that you want to do. Well, why should that be conditional? But it is going to be. When they describe programmability, that's what it's all about. That you can, I mean, of course, they present it from a positive side. We can give money to the people who really need it. That's how they will formulate it. But the other side of the coin is that this means that they have their ideas on who should spend money on what and when, and that will be reflected. And sometimes when you want to spend, they'll decide this is no good because you've already used too much carbon. Your carbon footprint is too big, or you've eaten too much beef, or whatever it may be. So we are talking about essentially some kind of social credit scoring or other similar system, and really it's not your money anymore. It is quite daring, and of course they've played this well, because Bitcoin and these cryptocurrencies have been used as the excuse. Oh, look, there's Bitcoin out there, so there's demand for digital currency, so we should offer it as a central bank. Well, no, that's complete nonsense, because the Bitcoiners will very quickly explain they're trying to flee from the bad policies of the central planners in the first place. Yeah. So I think that's one function that it clearly has already served, to allow central banks to come out and say, oh, CBDCs will be a good idea now. Yeah. But the other function, I think, has been to suppress the gold price, because Bitcoin has been marketed partly as sort of the digital gold. Since the central planners have created enormous amounts of money since 2020, one traditional and normal warning signal would be, watch the gold price go ballistic, and that hasn't happened. And one reason, of course, is the massive intervention by the biggest owners of gold, which is the central banks, to keep it down. And to make that task easier, it helps if there's other outlets for those doubters, and critics of central bank policies. Where else can they put their money? Well, there's Bitcoin, you see. Well, the push for CBDCs is the final step in a multi-decade program by central planners to increase their power over the people, over countries. This is the ultimate step, because the powers of CBDCs are so extraordinary that, I mean, even the worst dictators in past centuries could only have dreamt of having such enormous power over the lives of so many people. We are talking about a very dystopian future if we allow central banks to issue central bank digital currencies. You know, even if the original designers and heads of central banks who are launching this are super well-meaning, you know, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. We just know what human nature is like, and history is the best guide. If you give power to people, power gives temptations. And the reality is most people can't handle those temptations and will succumb to them. And the temptations of power are to do things that are not good for those that are under this power. I think the power would be abused, if not by the original generation of launchers, then by the next generation. I mean, who's to say that only, you know, 3 years later, 5 years later, the next generation thinks, well, now is the time to really use these tools, and it will be a completely totalitarian system of such frightening proportions, it's hard to imagine. There is a link to AI because, of course, I mean, one counter argument against this would be to say, well, okay, it's a power tool for central planners, but surely they're too busy, and how could they ever plan and micromanage, you know, 80 million people in Germany, or you know, all these millions of people? Well, that's where AI comes in, doesn't it? In other words, it'll be algorithms that will, for most of the majority, control their spending in the future. And of course, the algorithm will be centrally, you know, sort of programmed in certain directions. The micromanaging decision will then be automated. And that's even more dystopian and will be hugely, well, frustrating is probably the most benevolent way to put it. Because, you know, you're trying to do something that's genuinely good for everyone, but because of some quirks in the algorithm, you're not allowed to do it. You have no right to appeal. You know, the algorithm, because it's so many masses, you can't practically have an appeal process. You just won't be able to use your money for certain things, and then there's nothing you can do. And do we want to live in such a society where a small group of central planners have this extraordinary power over everyone's lives? I mean, there's no freedom. That, by definition, ends freedom. And then you don't even need to speculate what further horrible thing could happen after this or as a result of this. It's already enough, I think, to realize we must stop this, and that should be high priority. And I think we should go out and organize demonstrations in front of the central banks. In politics, political science, there's a theory called the theory of bureaucracy, and it argues quite convincingly, using human nature and recognition of how you work when you're in a bureaucratic system. Bureaucracy always wants to increase its powers. And that has been actually literally the history of central banking. They've used every step over the decades to just increase their power more and more and more. In fact, the central bankers have been beneficiaries of every crisis. So they had no incentive to avoid a crisis, because they know after the next crisis we get more power. And the argument has always been, oh wow, we couldn't stop this crisis because we didn't have enough power in this and that and that. And so after that crisis they get that. Now next crisis they will give you another excuse and then tell you why they needed more power. So this is literally what happened. I mean, in my book New Paradigm in Macroeconomics in 2005, I warned of the recurring banking crisis and the coming banking crisis, but also what was likely to happen with the next banking crisis. They're again going to reward the central planners. That's exactly what happened after the global financial crisis 2008, what's called the global financial crisis. They gave them even more powers. This creates this this process, and now of course to them CBDCs is like the pinnacle of what they could achieve, and they're so close to it, but we have to stop it. Has there been ever an example in history where when you give so much power to a small group of people over millions of other people, that this has been consistently used in a benevolent way and resulted in good outcomes? I mean, of course, we don't actually have a historical record on such enormous power. So we have to use examples of when there was less power in the hands of central planners, and that's already bad enough. Look at history. Dictators like Stalin and other dictators, they could have only dreamt of the enormous power that central bank digital currencies give to central planners. I mean, we are talking about dystopian digital prisons that will be created through central bank digital currencies, because the programmability, and this has been mentioned in the studies by central banks, include, of course, geography. And there's this proposal for climate change, for whatever reasons, that people should stay within their 15-minute walking small local area and be restricted, which, I mean, just the thought I find quite nightmarish, of being locked into your local area. And there will be digital controls, when you walk with all your RFID chips in your cards and your CBDC anyway. Of course, it will be immediately recognized if you're out of the area, and you will be punished. It's a digital prison. The COVID operation, I mean, it's quite clear that many of the policies had no proper medical justification or purpose. And so, whereas if you have the hypothesis that partly was used to even, sort of lay the groundwork for CBDCs, there's plenty of evidence. I mean, why did the Bank of England come out in March 2020, around the time when the first lockdown was announced, with its first sort of public consultation meeting online about, while we're locked down, about introducing CBDCs and all the benefits and needs of CBDCs. Also, of course, this vaccine passport, it was a way to push digital IDs, which are precondition for CBDCs. In order to introduce CBDCs, you need digital IDs. And digital IDs were meant to be introduced with the vaccine passport or health passport, which is a form of digital ID. And so there is a direct connection there to these COVID policies. I mean, the COVID policies were, given that they were medically not really justifiable, and some of them were very contradictory and nonsensical. And so, there's a combination of somewhat unusual policies, let's say, some quite surprising. But every country in the world seemed to have the same policies. Well, mostly certainly in Europe and North America. And so there was an extraordinary degree of coordination that was revealed to us. And clearly that didn't come from any democratic process, but somehow top down from behind the scenes. So I think a lot has been revealed about these processes from that experience. And that's really another reason why we should be against CBDCs. They've shown us what they're going to do. And an example is in Canada, in Ottawa, the demonstrations by the truckers, freedom demonstrations, very peaceful, quite clearly, peaceful demonstrations, but annoying for the government and criticizing government policies and all the restrictions on individual freedoms. So the Prime Minister wanted to stop that. And what did he do? Well, he quickly rammed through a new law that allowed the government to force the banks to freeze people's accounts, which is exactly the powers you will have with CBDCs. And so I think they showed their cards there. Of course, it was still more complicated because a law had to be passed. But once you have CBDCs, the central planners can do this for you. I mean, CBDCs clearly have their proponents in the central planners. And the central planners of all these countries, in the central banks, they meet, for example, there's a monthly meeting in Basel, Switzerland, at the BIS, Bank for International Settlements, of all these countries' central bank governors every month, and they discuss and coordinate their policies, and that's not a secret. The actual discussions are a secret. No minutes are being issued, but it's not a secret that they do meet and do coordinate, and as I said, the coordination is not in doubt anymore since 2020, the enormous high degree of coordination. So what we don't really precisely see is exactly, who is there behind the scenes and so on, and is it just the central planners? Are there other people? Clearly there's a link to the whole health sector. We also know that, there's big pharma, there's the big military industrial complex. There's certain concentrations of power that prefer not to be too transparent, that somehow seem to be involved in this process. There is already not just talk, I mean, there's concrete proposal, there's already various credit and debit cards that have the functionality that your spending will be analyzed, and you get a report on an ongoing basis of how much CO2 emissions are involved in your spending. And that's already being offered. MasterCard went out and is offering that. So things like that are likely to become very quickly the sort of tools and excuses for the fairly draconian but ultimately arbitrary centralized decisions, decrees on how you are allowed to spend your money. So we have to stop it.